Thanksgiving dinners were supposed to be about family, about love, about that long wooden table crowded with cousins, siblings, and laughter echoing through the halls. But this Thanksgiving, he sat quietly, unnoticed, while the rest of the family clinked glasses and cheered to togetherness. His seat at the table was deliberately left empty. Not because he was late, not because he didn't want to come, but because his own mother had crossed his name off the guest list. She didn't say it outright, but her message was clear. He wasn't worthy of being part of her perfect family gathering. From the outside, the irony was delicious. The very people celebrating inside the restaurant had no idea that the unwanted son was the man who owned the building, the chairs, the kitchen, and even the roasted turkey they were devouring. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand how this silent, almost invisible young man ended up hosting a Thanksgiving feast without a single thank you, we have to rewind. He wasn't always a restaurant owner. He wasn't always successful. In fact, for most of his life, he was the black sheep, the odd one out, the boy his mother thought would never measure up to her golden children. His siblings had college degrees, shiny jobs, and families that seemed picture-perfect. He, on the other hand, worked long nights, failed in school, and carried the stigma of being directionless. Yet beneath that quiet exterior was a fire. And sometimes, the ones nobody expects, the ones excluded, dismissed, and pushed to the shadows, are the ones who rise the highest. This is not just a Thanksgiving story. It's a story about rejection, about quiet resilience, about life's cruel ironies, and about the sweetest kind of redemption, the kind that doesn't need shouting, the kind that speaks for itself when everyone finally realizes who really mattered all along. So let's go back long before that dinner table, to the small town where he grew up, a boy no one believed in, especially not the woman who should have loved him unconditionally, his mother. He grew up in a modest house on the edge of town, where his mother's voice carried more weight than any law. She had a sharp tongue, sharper expectations, and the kind of coldness that could freeze a child's spirit before it even bloomed. His siblings were stars in her eyes. His older brother got into college on a scholarship. His sister played piano at church events, and even his younger cousins seemed to shine brighter. He was the boy who couldn't sit still in class, the one teachers described as distracted, unmotivated, difficult. At family gatherings, his mother would boast about the others. "David got an A in calculus," she'd say proudly, or, "Emily's already applying to medical school." And then her eyes would land on him with a sigh. No introduction, no praise, just silence. The message was loud enough. You don't belong in the family success story. He tried. Oh, he tried. He worked odd jobs after school, washing dishes, in diners, sweeping floors in grocery stores, mowing lawns for neighbors, not for fun, not even for money, but to feel useful, to prove to himself he wasn't the failure she painted him to be. Still, the stigma stuck. Teachers underestimated him, relatives whispered about him, and his mother. She treated him as though he were an embarrassing footnote to her otherwise polished life. The worst part wasn't even the neglect. It was the way she paraded her love for the others while withholding even the smallest scraps of approval from him. By the time he was 16, he stopped expecting hugs, stopped waiting for her to say, "I'm proud of you." Instead, he poured his heart into whatever work he could find. That's when he found the kitchen. It started with washing dishes at a local restaurant. Nothing glamorous, just long hours in hot steam and greasy water. But there was something about watching the cooks move, chopping, seasoning, tasting, that stirred something inside him. For the first time in his life, he felt a spark. He asked questions. He stayed late. He offered to help cut vegetables for free just to learn. And slowly, dishwashing turned into chopping onions into prepping meals into actually cooking. But here's the catch. His mother never once visited that diner, never once asked about his job. In her mind, kitchen work wasn't real work. Your brother's going to be a lawyer, she would say at the dinner table. Your sister's going to save lives. And when it came to him, she'd shake her head. And you? You'll be stuck in some kitchen your whole life. She thought it was an insult. He thought it just might be destiny. Turning point, rising conflict, 1,000 words. The years that followed weren't easy. He worked in kitchens across town, bouncing from one low-paying job to another. Sometimes the bosses were cruel. Sometimes customers treated him like he was invisible. But through it all, he learned. He collected recipes like treasures. He memorized techniques. He studied flavors, not in classrooms, but in the fire and chaos of crowded kitchens. One night, after a brutal double shift, he sat alone outside a restaurant dumpster, exhausted and smelling of grease. His phone buzzed with family messages, photos, of his siblings in graduation gowns, smiling with their proud mother. Not once did she send him a message that said, "How are you doing?" That night, something inside him shifted. He realized waiting for her approval was a losing game. If he wanted dignity, he'd have to create it for himself, and so he began saving. Dollar by dollar, tip by tip, paycheck by paycheck. He lived in a tiny apartment, ate cheap instant noodles, skipped luxuries. All for a dream even he wasn't sure was possible, owning his own restaurant. But dreams have a funny way of being tested. Because just when he thought he was getting ahead, life threw him back. A landlord raised his rent. A car broke down. One restaurant fired him without explanation. His savings dipped. His faith wavered. And through it all, his mother's silence remained constant. Still, he pushed forward. He started working 2 jobs, then 3. He sacrificed sleep, weekends, friendships, everything, just to keep his dream alive. And one day, an opportunity came. A struggling old restaurant in town went up for sale. It was beaten down, with peeling paint and broken chairs. But he saw something others didn't. He saw potential. Everyone told him it was crazy. He didn't have enough money. He didn't have the experience. He didn't even have his family's support. But he had one thing: stubborn resilience. So, with every dollar he had saved plus a small loan, he bought the place. It was his. Of course, owning it was just the beginning. He spent nights scrubbing floors, fixing pipes, painting walls, and even sleeping in the back when exhaustion overtook him. But slowly, painfully, the restaurant came to life. Word spread. People loved the food, his food. Customers returned. Reviews praised his authenticity, his flavors, his story. The boy who was once invisible was suddenly building something undeniable. But here's the irony. His own family had no idea. His mother. She never asked, never cared, never even stepped foot in his restaurant. Until one Thanksgiving. The Thanksgiving evening unfolded like a postcard. Long tables lined with roasted turkeys, candied yams, pumpkin pies, and glasses filled to the brim. Laughter spilled into the air as his mother basked in the glow of her perfect family. She gave toasts, complimented the food, and took subtle digs at the son who wasn't there, pretending as though he didn't even exist. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every waiter, every chef, every dish that touched their table carried his fingerprints. They were dining inside the very dream she once mocked, and then the moment came. As dessert was being served, the restaurant manager approached nervously. "Ma'am," he whispered, leaning toward her chair, "the owner would like to say a few words to the guests tonight." Her brows furrowed. "Owner? Well, fine. But make it quick. We're having a family celebration here." The chatter died down as the room dimmed slightly. From the back, he stepped forward, not in a suit, not in polished shoes, but in the simple attire of someone who worked with his hands. At first, nobody clapped, nobody understood. To them, he was just another face in the crowd. But then the manager's voice carried across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the owner of this restaurant." Forks clattered against plates. Chairs creaked as heads turned. His mother froze, wine glass suspended mid-air. The invisible sun stood before them, framed by the soft glow of the chandeliers, looking calm, steady, unshaken. For years, she had called him a failure. For years, she left him out of photographs, out of conversations, out of her heart. And now here he was, not asking for her approval, not begging for acknowledgement, but standing as the man who built everything they were enjoying that very night. He didn't make a long speech. He didn't need to. I just wanted to thank everyone for celebrating Thanksgiving here, he said, his voice firm but steady. It means more than you'll ever know. Every meal here, every plate served, is a part of a story most people never cared to hear. His mother's face burned crimson. She shifted in her seat, whispering harshly to a cousin as if scrambling for control. But the control was gone. The truth was undeniable. The son she had excluded was the reason her grand Thanksgiving table even existed. Some relatives clapped hesitantly, others exchanged stunned glances. And then, like a ripple through the room, realization spread. They weren't sitting in her celebration, they were sitting in his. It wasn't her pride on display, it was his resilience. The power shift was silent, but it shook louder than any argument. For once, she couldn't dismiss him. She couldn't rewrite the story. The boy she tried to erase had written his own chapter, and tonight, she was living inside it. He stepped back, offering a small nod before disappearing behind the kitchen doors. Not to hide, not to retreat, but to return to the place where it had all started. The kitchen, the fire, the labor that no one respected, until it crowned him with victory. His mother sat frozen at the table, fork untouched, her appetite gone. The entire family's laughter had stilled. The only sound now was the faint clinking of glasses and the pounding of her own regret. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the host. She was a guest at her son's table, and nothing in the world stung more than that. The silence after that Thanksgiving evening lingered long past dessert. For his mother, it was a silence filled with shame and realization. For him, it was a silence of peace, the kind that comes when you no longer need validation, because the truth has spoken louder than words ever could. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't linger to see the looks on their faces. His redemption wasn't about humiliating his family, it was about finally being free of their shadow. For the first time, he wasn't the forgotten son. He was his own man, standing tall in the very space where his mother once said he would never belong. The days after the Thanksgiving dinner were telling. Some relatives called him, their voices dripping with newfound admiration. "We had no idea," they said. "You've done so well for yourself." But he answered politely, never gloating, never rubbing salt in wounds. He knew their shock wasn't about him, it was about their own blindness. His mother, however, remained quiet. The woman who had filled every gathering with boasts about her successful children suddenly had no words. For years, she had overlooked him. Now, she couldn't look past him. But here's the part that mattered most. He didn't carry bitterness. Yes, he remembered the pain of being excluded, the sting of being labeled a failure, the hollow feeling of being left out of his own family. But success had done something strange. It had softened him. It had replaced his need for revenge with a desire for peace. He poured himself deeper into his restaurant, not to prove anyone wrong anymore, but to serve the community that had believed in him, the customers who gave him a chance when no one else did. The young workers he now trained, giving them the mentorship he never had. Every holiday season, his restaurant filled with people who didn't have families to celebrate with, lonely, veterans, single mothers, college kids far from home. He made sure they had a table, a meal, and a place to belong. Because he knew, better than anyone, how it felt to be left out. And that became his redemption. Not the applause, not the money, not the recognition, but turning his pain into compassion, turning rejection into welcome. Years later, when people spoke his name in town, they didn't talk about the boy who failed. They spoke about the man who built something lasting, the man who turned a rundown diner into a place of joy and comfort, the man who quietly showed everyone that dignity doesn't come from approval, it comes from endurance. Even his siblings, once oblivious to his struggles, began visiting. They brought their children, who adored the fun uncle with endless stories about perseverance and kindness. And slowly, the next generation grew up seeing him not as invisible but as unforgettable. And what about his mother? Time has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. She did visit eventually. Hesitant, eyes lowered, pride cracked but not fully broken. She sat at one of his tables, ordered a meal, and for the first time in decades, looked at him not as a burden, but as a man. She didn't say the words he once longed for. She didn't suddenly transform into a nurturing, apologetic mother. But in her silence, in the way her eyes softened when she looked around at the bustling restaurant, at the customers praising her son's cooking, at the waitstaff calling him, "Sir," there was an unspoken acknowledgement. And that was enough. Because he no longer needed her words. His life had already spoken for itself. The redemption wasn't about her finally admitting she was wrong. It was about him no longer caring if she did. He had built his identity not on her approval, but on his own resilience. Today, the restaurant thrives. He doesn't flaunt his success, doesn't chase headlines or awards. But when he walks into a room now, people listen. When he offers advice to young workers, they lean in. When he gives back to his community, it carries weight. He's no longer invisible. He's undeniable, and every Thanksgiving, when his restaurant hosts its annual free dinner for the homeless and the lonely, he quietly takes a seat at the back. He doesn't sit in silence anymore. He sits in gratitude. Gratitude for the struggles that shaped him, for the resilience that carried him, and even for the rejection that pushed him to build a life far greater than anyone ever imagined. Because sometimes the greatest redemption isn't proving others wrong, it's proving yourself right. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories every day. They once called him the failure, the boy who couldn't keep up in school, the son his mother left off the invitation list, the one nobody believed in. But the truth? He wasn't failing. He was becoming. Every night in greasy kitchens, every dollar saved, every moment of rejection was shaping him into something stronger. He didn't need his mother's praise. He didn't need the family's applause. Because dignity doesn't come from the spotlight. It comes from resilience in the shadows. And that's what makes his story unforgettable. He could have spent his life bitter. He could have chased revenge, flaunted his success, and rubbed it in every face that doubted him. But instead, he built something better, a place where others who felt invisible could finally belong. Isn't that the greatest kind of victory? To turn pain into purpose? To take exclusion and transform it into welcome? And here's the twist. Years later, his restaurant was recognized not just for its food, but for its heart. A local newspaper honored him with a Community Champion award for feeding the homeless every Thanksgiving. And when he walked onto that stage to accept it, the crowd rose in applause. Not for the meals, not for the fame, but for the man who never gave up. Sitting quietly in that audience was his mother. For the first time in her life, she clapped for him. Not because she was proud of herself, not because she could boast to others, but because the truth was undeniable. The son she once excluded had built a legacy far greater than her approval could have ever given him. And so, we're left with a question, dear viewers. How many failures in our lives are actually seeds waiting to bloom? How many people do we dismiss as invisible, when in reality they are carrying dreams bigger than we could imagine? Maybe the next time you see someone overlooked, underestimated, or left out, remember this story. Remember the boy who was denied a seat at his mother's Thanksgiving table, only to own the very table everyone celebrated at. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is already the one who built it. Success doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits, patiently, until the world finally notices. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.